The headline in the Times today: columnists shun Jewish newspaper over false articles. And erring on the side of caution, they put the phrase false articles in quotes. Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect magazine, former editor of The Guardian, joins me to discuss this. There are two stories here, Alan. There is the story about malfeasance at the Jewish Chronicle, and then there is the story about the apparent owner, or certainly the frontman for whoever the owner is, and his continuing role influencing editorial policy and lecturing BBC journalists on impartiality. So we'll keep them separate if we can. Can you begin by explaining what the Jewish Chronicle stands accused of?
The Jewish Chronicle stands accused of running a number of articles by a man called Elon Perry, some of them extremely sensational, and which really suited the agenda of Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. And a correspondent for the 972 website in Israel, David Reif, investigated one of these stories along with other Israeli journalists, and they concluded that the story was complete fantasy. They quoted the intelligence community at the IDF, calling them wild fabrications, 100% lies, and totally baseless. And he wrote this up about 10 days ago, and it took a long time for the Jewish Chronicle to do anything about it.
Ben Reif, I think, rather than David, but not alone, of course. Other Israeli media looking into this, and up to and including the Israeli Defense Force, weighing in on the story about the Philadelphia corridor and describing some of the stuff being published in a British newspaper aimed at the Jewish community as demonstrably and dangerously false.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a suggestion that this really was a leak from Bibi Netanyahu's office. That hasn't been proved, but this is what the intelligence community sources have been speculating. And the journalists then looked at this guy, Elon Perry, and found that many of the claims he made for himself, such as that he was a lecturer at Tel Aviv University, or that he took part in the 1976 Entebbe raid in Uganda, were baseless. So he has the feeling of somebody who is, how can one put it politely, unreliable.
Although he, of course, denies all the allegations, describes them as a witch hunt, and has said that he provided the newspaper with great stories and scoops. Put the resignation of several prominent columnists in context for us, if you can, Alan. Hadley Freeman of the Sunday Times, Jonathan Friedland, one of your columnists when you were at The Guardian, still there now, David Aranovich, BBC presenter, former Times columnist. They have all, and David Baddiel has said he has no plans to write any more columns. They have all publicly and powerfully disowned, essentially, the current regime at the Jewish Chronicle.
Well, why it matters is that the Jewish Chronicle, at its best, represented or strove to represent the whole Jewish community in the UK. Now, in recent years, particularly since October the 7th, but I think before that, a lot of more liberal Jews in this country were very apprehensive about the line that the Jewish Chronicle was taking, which was very pro-Likud, very pro-Netanyahu. Somebody who was part of the consortium who recently took it over described it as my country, right or wrong. So it was really important for the editor, Jake Wallace-Simons, that these more liberal figures, Jonathan and Hadley and the two Davids, Aronovich and Baddiel, were there to act as a counterbalance to the overwhelming direction of the paper. So for them all to have up sticks is pretty devastating for the paper's reputation.
Which brings us to Robbie Gibb, doesn't it? Or Sir Robbie Gibb, to give him his full title. Former producer on one of Andrew Neil's BBC programmes, former head of politics at the broadcast Westminster Politics at the BBC during the Brexit referendum. What is his role? You wrote about this in Prospect some months ago, and we weren't entirely clear then. Are we any clearer now?
Not much, no. It is a curious thing happened in 2020. The Jewish Chronicle was in some financial trouble. And out of the blue, a group of the great and the good swooned in, and not all of them Jewish, and bought the paper in inverted commas, because I don't think it was their own money. And Robbie Gibb appeared in Companies House as 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, though clearly he wasn't.
Because
But
whoever
he never
is
revealed.
had to be in a position to write off £3.5 million worth of loan, I think.
Yeah, it was an investment of some millions,
Right.
and you have to take on the ongoing losses of the paper, which are in hundreds of thousands. So it's clearly not Robbie Gibb. And I tried to find out who was the owner. And I met a complete blank wall. Nobody would say who the owner was. I asked the editor, and he said, "Well, that's not really my department." So, I mean, I struggle to think of any example in British history, let's say over the last 100 years, where a significant paper, we don't know who owns it. It's just unheard of. And yet that's the stance that they've continued to the day. And this is significant because Gibb, as the 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle, if he still is, sits on the crucial key editorial standards committee of the BBC, which the chairman, Samir Shah, said is about to investigate the BBC's coverage of the Middle East and Gaza. I can't see how he can possibly sit on that committee and portray himself as a beacon of impartiality, sitting in judgment on BBC journalists when he has this ownership of this paper, and which is now mired in a crisis of its own.
So you think his position is untenable at the BBC?
I think there's no question that he can't sit on this editorial standards committee any longer, I think. And the fact that he signs up to transparency when he becomes a BBC director, and yet he refuses to say who owns this paper that he is down on paper as owning.
And of course, not that long ago, we were reading reports that he was lecturing BBC journalists on impartiality itself.
Well, he's taken I think this is what pisses off a lot of BBC journalists, excuse my French, but he does lecture BBC journalists regularly on impartiality, and has even tried to intervene to stop appointments because he doesn't consider
This would be Jess Brammer, the former deputy editor of Newsnight, who he was keen not to see appointed to an executive position.
He stands on a pulpit of his own lecturing about impartiality. And yet he seems not to be able to see the problem that his covert ownership, I say that in inverted commas, because as I say, he doesn't own them, but he refuses to say who does own it, of this paper, which is now, I mean, this is not the first time they've been in some ethical difficulties. And the regulator, IPSO of the press, was even invited to conduct a formal investigation into the standards. And one of the reasons for turning it down was they said it had new owners, which made me laugh, because they don't know who the owners are.
Does not know or does not care. How much of this should be concerning Lisa Nandy, the relatively newly installed Secretary of State for Media? But I'm thinking of the BBC role.
Samir Shah was up in front of a House of Lords committee the other day, and he, as the incoming chair of the BBC, said he thought it was a real problem that 10 out of the 14 board members of his board were appointed by the government. Now, we saw the problem that the last regime, the Tory government, had in trying to influence the BBC, trying to make appointments to the BBC, trying to make appointments to Ofcom. Gibb was in that up to his elbows in those machinations, and the BBC lives or dies by being independent. So I think Lisa Nandy has got to think carefully about how she can protect the BBC from this kind of interference in future.
Alan Rusbridger, many thanks, editor of Prospect Magazine.